The homeowners association constructed a water line directly across my property without any notification. One day, construction equipment arrived and destroyed everything I held dear, including the oak I had planted in memory of my deceased wife, while my granddaughter witnessed the devastation through tears. Carla, the HOA leader, simply smiled coldly beside the officer she had brought along, claiming this served the community's interests. I devised a strategy to permanently block their water access. However, she was unaware that her entire operation was founded on deception, a hidden truth that would soon make me the most influential figure in the entire region. If you're wondering where you're viewing this from, please share in the comments because what follows is unbelievable. And if you think property owners should triumph over a dishonest HOA, please subscribe because you'll appreciate how this tale concludes. The initial warning wasn't a notice or telephone call. It was bright orange visibility gear visible through the trees near the stream. I was repairing a loose porch plank with my granddaughter Elise, drawing in her sketchbook nearby when I spotted it. You become familiar with your land's natural patterns, how wildlife moves at twilight, the distinct cry of a circling hawk. Fluorescent orange jackets and surveying equipment don't belong to that natural order. I set down my tool and instructed Elise to remain there. Though my joints aren't as flexible as before, I descended the pasture slope quickly. This was my property, all 20 acres of it, and I hadn't requested any surveying work. 3 workers were driving markers into the earth several dozen yards from the water source. The youngest noticed my approach and whispered to the man holding the paperwork. When I reached them, they had prepared their response. I maintained a calm tone. "Good morning. May I assist you, gentlemen?" The supervisor, clearly uncomfortable, avoided eye contact. "Simply performing our duties, sir." I gestured toward the property boundary they had crossed 50 yards behind them. "Your duties are being conducted on my land. I didn't engage your services." He finally met my gaze, sighing as though I was his day's greatest nuisance. "We have proper authorization. HOA easement expansion." I nearly chuckled. "I'm not part of your HOA. Never was. This ranch existed long before your planned community was even conceived." He merely gestured with his pen toward the manicured lawns visible beyond the hill. "Take it up with them. We have our work orders." They resumed their tasks, a clear dismissal. They were merely contractors, but standing on my own property being treated as invisible, I felt anxiety building in my chest. This ranch meant more than soil and boundaries to me. I purchased it after losing my wife, Claire. We had always discussed acquiring land like this, somewhere the world couldn't intrude. After her passing, it seemed the only meaningful action remaining. It was meant to be a healing place. When my daughter and son-in-law died in an automobile accident 2 years afterward, this property became the only real home my granddaughter Elise had known. It was our refuge, where I had planted Claire's memorial oak on the ridge above the creek. We would sit there together while I shared stories about her grandmother. The land preserved our memories. It was all that remained of them. Therefore, when Carla Withers appeared at my gate 3 days following the surveyor's visit, accompanied by 2 sheriff's officers, I understood this wasn't a simple miscommunication. She appeared to be in her 50s with rigid posture, clutching her paperwork like a shield. "Mr. Travis," she declared rather than asked, "we're here regarding the water line." One officer, younger than his partner, appeared visibly uncomfortable. The other maintained a fixed stare ahead. Carla handled all communication, brandishing her documents. "The community board has approved the water pipeline. The easement is legally valid. Construction begins next week." I repeated what I had told the surveyors. "This is private property. You have no easement rights here." She offered a thin, patronizing smile. "We discovered a loophole in the original county records from the 1970s. Our legal team confirms it's completely lawful. The pipeline proceeds regardless of your objections." I spent the following days exhausting my savings, contacting every property attorney in the area. Most never returned my calls. The one who did meet me for coffee examined Carla's papers and shook his head. "I apologize, Mr. Travis," he said, sliding the documents back. "She's correct. They found an obscure piece of outdated public utility legislation that hasn't been used in 50 years. It's unlikely to succeed, but challenging it would cost you everything, and you'd probably lose." He looked directly at me. "They understand this. That's their strategy. Hope is peculiar, You don't realize how tightly you're clinging to it until it vanishes. I left that meeting feeling empty. They possessed all the authority, resources, and legal advantages. I had nothing except a deed to land they were about to divide. The bulldozers arrived at sunrise the following Monday. The sound awakened me, a deep, earth-shaking rumble completely foreign to this place. I stood on the porch with cold coffee, watching them cross my pasture. The dew-covered green grass peeled away like an open wound. Elise joined me, her small hand gripping mine. She remained silent, which was worse than tears. They worked methodically and efficiently. The lead bulldozer's blade lowered as it began its slow, unstoppable advance toward the creek, heading directly for the ridge where Claire's oak stood. I wanted to shout, to rush out there and block the machine. But what purpose would that serve? I'd be arrested while they continued digging. So I stood frozen as the steel blade struck the trunk. The tree resisted briefly, then with a splintering crack I felt in my bones, it shuddered and toppled. My wife's memorial destroyed instantly. My granddaughter sobbed quietly and pressed against my side. I held her tightly, watching the machine crush the stump and continue forward. A quiet devastation settled over me. They weren't merely taking my land, they were erasing my past. I led Elise inside, shut out the noise, and felt something within me change. The grief remained, but something else emerged to meet it, something cold, hard, and patient. I walked to the front gate and observed the chaos they were creating with my life. If they were going to take what belonged to me, I would have to reclaim something in return. My initial plan wasn't revenge, it was reasoning. I thought if I could address these people directly, perhaps I could make them understand. The HOA conducted its monthly board meeting in a sterile community center that smelled of chlorine and artificial air. Though not a member, the meetings were technically open to county residents who registered as guests. So I dressed in a clean shirt, gathered my property documents, and entered their territory. The room was mostly vacant, just a few disinterested homeowners scattered in seats. At the front, behind a long folding table, sat Carla Withers and 4 other board members. She commanded this space, tapping her pen on papers, projecting self-importance. When my turn arrived to speak, I approached their small podium and kept my voice steady, presenting the facts. I explained that the ranch had been in my family's name, free of any HOA involvement for decades. I described the well and spring feeding the creek, how it was a delicate ecosystem I used for livestock, my small garden, and the fire pond essential during dry seasons. I tried to help them see the land as something living, not merely an obstacle to development. Carla allowed me about 2 minutes before raising her hand, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Travis," she said with artificial courtesy. She then retrieved a document from her briefcase. A man in an inexpensive suit beside her stood and delivered it to me. "We anticipated you might have ongoing concerns," she continued, smirking. I examined the paper he had given me, a cease and desist order legally preventing me from interfering with their construction. The suited man introduced himself as the HOA's attorney. "We are completely within our rights," he said smoothly. "But I want to assure you, you'll retain access to the main water supply as a courtesy. A courtesy on my own property." He spoke as though granting me a royal favor. The room fell silent. Other board members studied their notes. The lawyer continued discussing community benefits and increased property values, but I had stopped listening. I stood holding that document, feeling heat rise in my face. They hadn't come to listen, they had come to silence me. Hope crushed. I left the clubhouse into the evening air, hands trembling slightly. A man who had been seated in the back followed me to the parking lot. He was roughly my age with deep worry lines across his face. "Don't let her affect you," he said quietly, glancing back at the building. "She does this to everyone." He introduced himself as Mike, a 20-year resident. The HOA had fined him $600 last month because his garbage cans were visible from the street for 2 hours beyond the allowed time. Another neighbor faced a lien for planting an unauthorized rose bush. Everyone was frustrated but frightened, he explained. Carla controlled the board through fines and legal threats. "That pipeline is her personal project," Mike whispered, looking around nervously. "Her brother owns the contracting company that won the bid. Interesting coincidence, isn't it?" He suspected she was receiving kickbacks, using community funds for a project primarily benefiting her family's business. She had manipulated contracts, burying details in fine print nobody read. That's when a detail from their papers clicked in my mind. On their survey map, their chosen route seemed inefficient, cutting across the most difficult section of my pasture, rocky and challenging terrain. Why not follow the flatter, easier path near the main road? Nobody inside was listening, but my engineering mind began working. Something was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. I thanked Mike and drove home. Over the next few days, I watched the trench grow, a deep muddy scar snaking across my land, filling with murky water after brief rainfall. A grim canal separating me from my own memories. One afternoon, unable to bear it anymore, I walked past my damaged fence, boots sinking into the soft excavated soil beside the trench. I needed to see where it led. I followed the destruction's path. The trench ran straight for several hundred yards, then took a sharp 90-degree turn, heading directly toward the oldest part of the spring system. The survey map they had shown me was incorrect. It wasn't just inefficient, it was deliberately misleading. It showed the pipeline accessing the main creek flow, a source vaguely covered under public domain according to their loophole. But that wasn't where this trench's water originated. I could hear it now, a faint but steady gurgling. I followed the sound past their dig site's end, pushing through overgrown brush. There it was, the real source. Not the main creek at all. They had accessed a smaller secondary spring, the original spring head feeding everything downstream. A source located entirely on my neighbor's land, a forgotten plot upstream belonging to an elderly man who had died years ago. I stood watching clear, clean water bubble up from the earth before being diverted into their ugly ditch. They weren't accessing a public utility, they were tapping a private spring, assuming no one would discover the difference. Their entire grand project, legal threats, and empire of dirt was built on pure arrogant ignorance. They had no idea where the water actually originated. And looking up at that overgrown, forgotten piece of land, I realized something else. It was untouched. It was for sale. And I knew exactly what needed to be done. My first call was to George Lindell, an old friend from our shared engineering background before he became a government hydrologist. He's more comfortable with topographical maps than people, but if you want to understand water, where it is, where it's been, and where it's going, there's no one better. He listened quietly as I explained my discovery, offering only a low grunt of interest. He arrived the next morning and we walked the fence line, not toward the HOA's muddy trench, but upstream onto the overgrown neighboring property. It was a tangle of weeds and fallen branches, the old cottage barely visible through brush. We followed the water's sound, and when we found the spring, it was like entering a hidden sanctuary, a perfect circle of clear water bubbling up between smooth stones, surrounded by ferns. It was the heart of the entire valley's water system. George knelt, dipping his hand in the water. He didn't need fancy equipment. He observed the flow, land angle, and Earth's shape around it. After silent observation, he stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "Well, Jack," he said calmly, but with a hard edge, "congratulations. You found the crime scene." He explained it simply enough for anyone to understand. The HOA's maps were technically accurate, but deliberately incomplete. They showed their pipeline drawing from the creek on my land, which their legal loophole gave them a weak claim to. But the creek was merely a symptom. This spring was the cause. "They built a straw to drink your milkshake," George said, pointing. "But they stuck it in your neighbor's glass, thinking no one was home." Carla's entire plan was built on arrogance. She assumed I was just some old rancher who wouldn't know the difference, that no one would ever walk upstream to verify her work. Back at my kitchen table, a plan began forming. It was desperate, a long shot, but all I had. I accessed county tax records on my old computer. The upstream property with the true spring was listed under Arthur Miller, deceased. Property taxes hadn't been paid in 3 years. It was in foreclosure, scheduled for online county auction in 2 weeks. The starting bid was low, just back taxes and fees. It was a bargain for 10 acres and a dilapidated house. To me, it represented nearly everything I had left in the world. Sitting there staring at the screen, I watched the HOA's construction crew from my window. They weren't connecting final pipes yet, just running tests, flushing the system. I recognized this from my engineering days. They were rushing, cutting corners to get water flowing and prove their project successful before final permits were approved. Their haste was my opportunity. They were building a house on sand, and I was about to purchase the beach. The following week was a blur of quiet, frantic activity. I liquidated the savings bonds Claire and I had bought when first married. I sold my restored tractor to a collector in the next town, the one I had planned to teach Elise to drive. It felt like selling my own history, but it was necessary. I contacted my Veterans Association representative and began paperwork to access my service savings. Each transaction was painful, another piece of my safety net being cut away. One evening, Elise found me sitting in darkness, the auction website's glow illuminating my face. She didn't need to ask what I was doing. She's intelligent. She knew we were in trouble. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "are you scared?" Looking at her worried eyes, I couldn't lie. "Yes, I am," I admitted. "But I'm more frightened of what happens if I do nothing. If I don't defend this place now, what am I teaching you?" She nodded and squeezed my arm. One final piece remained. I called Mike from the HOA meeting, sharing part of my plan, not everything but enough. I asked him to quietly purchase shares in the local water service cooperative, the small utility managing regional water rights. He didn't hesitate. Auction day arrived. I sat at my kitchen table, the website countdown ticking like a bomb. My hands were sweating. I had consolidated all my money into a single account. This was it, one bid, everything I had. If someone else wanted that land, I couldn't compete. In the final 30 seconds, bidding started jumping. My heart pounded. I waited until the counter reached 10 seconds, took a deep breath, and entered my maximum amount. I clicked the button. The screen flashed, confirming my bid. The timer reached 0. Sold. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Then a slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't about victory, not yet. It was about what came next. I looked out at the trench scarring my land, at the pipes leading to water they thought was theirs. Let's see how they react when I own the well they built upon. Winning the auction was just the beginning. Paperwork took a week where I watched Carla's brother's crew connecting their precious pipeline's final sections. They worked arrogantly in broad daylight, so confident in their power, unaware they were trespassing on land now legally mine. The day the deed was officially recorded, I didn't celebrate. I got to work. George returned with his maps and a simple plan. We wouldn't destroy anything or sabotage their pipeline. We would simply restore the natural order. The spring on my new property originally fed 2 small channels. One trickled toward the main creek on my ranch. The other, smaller one, flowed into a natural depression that irrigated the Miller property's pasture land. Years of neglect had clogged the second channel with leaves and debris. All we needed to do was clear it out. It took 2 hours of hard work with shovels and a rake. We excavated the old channel, deepened it slightly, and reinforced the banks with nearby stones. It wasn't complicated engineering, just giving water an easier path to follow. And water, like truth, always seeks the path of least resistance. With the new channel clear, George and I stepped back. The clear, cold spring water bubbled up, and instead of flowing toward the HOA's intake pipe, it simply turned and followed our newly cleared path, flowing gently away from their trench and disappearing into my new pasture's thirsty earth. We had effectively turned off the tap. We returned to my porch and made fresh coffee.